How's everyone's lunch? Great. My name is Brenton Lee, and I work with Community Benefit, and I wanted to start the process. Thanks. Well, I just took a walk around the room to see how many of you had heated raised advice earlier this morning to get more plant food and greens on your plate, and I have to say I'm mighty impressed. So well done to all of you. Continue to thrive. Well, talking about thriving, that's what I had in mind back in January. John and I had just finished announcing the 18 David Lawrence Community Service winners. And we were trying to check off another box on our list, and that box was finding a keynote speaker. We were looking for a speaker that lined up well with our efforts at KP to help people improve and change their lives for the better. Well, John and I brainstormed, and we wanted to live up to the inspiring speeches given by our previous symposium speakers, Craig Kielberger and Rebecca Oney. And after some back and forth, John and I had zero ideas. We were really struggling and weren't really sure where to go with this year's symposium keynote speaker. So a few days passed, and I decided I better get going on this brainstorming. So I thought I would check the internet for inspiration. So before I even typed in the search phrase, I kind of went all squirrel, and I saw in the left-hand corner the topics that were trending, and I saw the name Sam Polk. So I thought to myself, Sam Polk. I'm pretty sure that was a previous president of the United States. I wonder why he's trending this morning. So I clicked on Sam Polk, fully expecting to find that picture I remember from my U.S. history class. And instead of seeing that picture, I saw a picture of a vibrant young man, Sam Polk. And over the next few hours, as I did more searching on him, I realized that the reason he had been trending was because of an op-ed piece he had written in the New York Times called For the Love of Money. And in the end, after doing all that research on him, I was completely mesmerized, not because he had left his Wall Street career behind, but because of what he has since done with his life. So after Sam left Wall Street, he did a number of things, including volunteering and moving from New York City back to his native Southern California. What really invigorated me about Sam's story was that he realized he wanted to do something meaningful that would change lives. This has led Sam to start up a new nonprofit called Grocery Ships. Grocery Ships just launched their inaugural class of 8 families from South Central Los Angeles that come together each week for 6 months. This first class will graduate at the end of July, and at the beginning of August, a new class of 10 families will start their journey with Sam. It is with great pleasure that I introduce the executive director and founder of Grocery Ships, Sam Polk.
Hi, everybody. I'm honored to be here, and I'm excited to tell you a little of what I've come to learn about service over the past few years and about the nonprofit I founded and run called Grocery Ships. The name is inspired. Oh, we're supposed to have graphics up here. Here we go. The name is inspired by what we aim to do, which is give scholarships for groceries, comprehensive 6-month program of nutrition education and emotional support for low-income families struggling with food-related issues like obesity and diabetes. But before I tell you what Grocery Ships is and how it came to be, I'd like to start by digressing and sharing a story from my childhood, which I think should shed some light on why I'm so honored to be here today. When I was a sophomore in high school, my mom started suffering from these headaches. At first, they were sort of your average run-of-the-mill type, but over the course of a week, they escalated. And soon they became so debilitating that All she could do was lie in bed and clutch her head and moan into her pillow. One day, when my brothers and sister were at school, the pain got so bad that she couldn't take it anymore. So one day, she was able to make it from her bed to the car, and she drove herself to the emergency room. A few hours after school ended that day, I got a call from my dad telling me to meet him at the hospital. Mom had just gone in for emergency brain surgery to relieve the pressure from a subdural hematoma. And so I waited in the lobby of the hospital with my family, and for 6 hours I sat in silence waiting for the news. And just when I thought I couldn't bear it any longer, the surgeon appeared. And when he told me that my mom had pulled through, I let out an involuntary sob. And he told me that if she hadn't gotten to the hospital when she did, she would have had just a few hours to live. The name of that hospital was Kaiser Permanente on Sunset Boulevard in Los Angeles. I grew up in a Kaiser family. My younger brother and sister were born at Kaiser. And so when I say that I'm honored to be here, I mean it with all my heart. Thank you for taking care of my mom and my family. So I'd like to start today with a question, which is this. Have you ever spent years of your life chasing a dream, only to arrive at the destination and think, is this really all there is? Have I made a terrible mistake? Just a few short years ago, that was me. I was standing at the proverbial fork in the road, asking myself what was a difficult question for me. Do I continue on my path to becoming a member of the elite 1%? Or do I walk away from it all and follow my heart? I was, at 30 years old, a senior trader for one of the largest hedge funds in the world. And I was, from the outside, my life looked pretty great, but inside I was racked with conflict and internal distress because in the 8 years since I'd been on Wall Street, I'd come to see the world in an entirely different way. And when I looked at myself, I no longer liked what I saw. So before I tell you about grocery ships and how our nonprofit grocery ships came to be, I'd first like to take you back in time down a very for-profit road. When I was a little kid, I daydreamed about becoming incredibly rich and successful. And my first major step towards that goal was getting into Columbia University. And then in my junior year at Columbia, I took an even more critical step towards that goal. I got a summer internship at Credit Suisse First Boston, one of the most prestigious investment banks in the world. It was actually sort of a miracle that I'd gotten that internship because my first few years of college had been an epic disaster. As soon as I had arrived on campus, I'd gone into full-blown party mode, drinking and drugs. That is tequila on my shirt. I was so good at those extracurricular activities that by the middle of my sophomore year, I'd actually been kicked off the wrestling team, arrested twice for fist fighting, and suspended from college for burglarizing the dorm room of a campus drug dealer in hopes of stealing his stash. I am very thankful that social media wasn't a big deal back then. But after I got suspended from college, I had to face facts that I had a problem. So I quit doing drugs, and after the suspension, I came back to Columbia and buckled down and brought my grades up, and that's how I got that summer internship. Phew, I thought, my life is back on track. I'm on path to graduating from Columbia. I've got this incredible internship, and even better, I have this absolutely beautiful girlfriend who I was crazy about. Well, 3 weeks into that internship, that girlfriend dumped me. And it was one of those first love, didn't see it coming heartbreaks, and I was so blindsided that I couldn't eat, I couldn't sleep, and I couldn't make it into work. And so, desperate, I reached out to a counselor and asked for help. Now, I'd actually met this counselor a year before when my now ex-girlfriend had insisted we go to couples counseling as a 21-year-old. We were living in LA at the time and for the summer, and my drinking had gotten out of hand, which is what she said, and so she insisted we go see this woman, Linda. Now, Linda was this 6-foot-tall blonde woman with shoulder-length blonde hair, but what I noticed was she wore these pastel-colored, loose, flowy, sort of hippie-style clothes that to me looked totally out there, and as if the initial Earth Mother impression wasn't bad enough, halfway through our session, she said, she referred to herself as a spiritual teacher. And that's when I realized that she wasn't even a trained psychologist. She went on to explain that her teachings were grounded in Native American belief systems. And she used words like circle consciousness and spiritual disconnection that to me sounded absolutely ridiculous. So within a few minutes of meeting her, I dismissed her as a New Age quack. I went to a few more sessions to pacify my girlfriend, but then I put an abrupt end to the whole thing. But then cut to a year later, when I got dumped, she was the only counselor I knew. So I picked up the phone, and the thing was I was no longer concerned about her approach because all I wanted was relief from my own personal hell. And so I called her. And so in our first session, she quickly assessed that my problem with drinking and drugs was actually a symptom of a deeper problem, which she called a spiritual disconnection. And she said if I was going to regain wholeness or reconnect to my heart, I'd have to start by getting sober. Now, her words still made me roll my eyes, but she was now my only port in the storm. And so I followed her guidance, and I gave up drinking and went back to work a few days later. And now on the trading floor, I felt so raw and exposed without alcohol in my system that it was all I could do to not burst into tears on the trading floor. And after work, I would come home and either talk to Linda, which I started doing twice a week, or do the spiritual work she suggested, meditating, writing in a journal, reading spiritual books. And I didn't like any of this. But I thought, hey, if this is what it takes for me to pull it together to get a full-time job on Wall Street, so be it. But then one day she returned to this subject of spiritual disconnection. It was her belief that I had lost touch with my own inherent value, a condition, she said, that is pervasive in the Western world. And she said, perhaps this was not, my spiritual disconnection was behind not only my drinking and drug use, but also perhaps it was behind my need to become rich and successful because I was seeking to prove to the world and to myself that I was valuable. She then introduced a Native American concept called circle consciousness, which said that every life, from the moment that you're born, you're inherently valuable. No one life more valuable than another, which, she said, goes against our sort of widespread but often unspoken Western belief, which is that some people are more valuable than others. But she said not to worry. It is possible to reconnect with your inherent value. And when that happens to people, they bloom like flowers. Flowers? Really? Honestly, I didn't care about Native American blooming flower belief systems. Hadn't I made it clear that all I wanted was to get over this breakup so I could get back to the business of amassing my Wall Street fortune? But soon the strangest thing happened. After a few weeks, I found that instead of looking at these calls with Linda as a necessary evil, I was actually looking forward to them because Linda listened so intently to my thoughts and ideas that for the first time in my life, I felt like I was being valued for just being me. And in her presence, it felt like I had nothing to prove. That then started this very bizarre time in my life where by day I was a fierce Prada loafer-wearing, trading floor warrior. By night, I was meditating and journaling to reconnect to my inner voice, my heart. I was living a double life, and in truth, a pretty lonely one. Wall Street is a surreal place to have a spiritual awakening. But soon I found that the work I was doing at night, Linda's work, was actually helping me advance up the corporate ladder. And within a few years, my life started looking like I'd always imagined. I ate in the fanciest restaurants. I wore expensive suits. I took lavish Caribbean vacations. And I lived in a $6,500 a month loft apartment in the Village. However, with each passing year, whenever I'd receive a bonus or pay the bill at a fancy restaurant, Linda's words would come rushing back to me about how I was seeking value through money and achievements. And when I heard those words, all of a sudden my accomplishments seemed less impressive. They made me feel hollow. And aware of this double life struggle, my twin brother recommended one day a book to me that he'd just finished called Tattoos on the Heart by Father Greg Boyle, who's a Jesuit priest in Los Angeles that founded the gang rehabilitation organization called Homeboy Industries. And Father Greg had dedicated his life to working with gang members, and what impressed me the most was the profound respect he had for these young, marginalized men and women of Los Angeles. He referred to gang members and the work he had done with them as the greatest privilege of his life. And it seemed that Father Greg believed that gang members were as valuable as anybody else in society, and so instead of spending his life clawing his way to the top, he'd actually spend his life reaching down below him and picking people up and reminding them of their own worth. And as I finished the book and I closed it, I understood the meaning of circle consciousness, this idea that every life is equally valuable, no matter where in our society you come from. And more importantly, I saw that it was possible to create a place of circle consciousness in the modern world. Now, a few weeks after I finished that book, the market took a nosedive. And within months, millions of people lost jobs, their retirement savings, their home. But not us. We actually made money during the crash. So one day I was in a meeting with one of my billionaire bosses and a few other people, and we were discussing the new hedge fund regulations being talked about by Congress. And everybody in the room thought they were a terrible idea, but I had Father Boyle and Linda in the back of my mind. And so I blurted out without thinking about it, but isn't it better for the system as a whole? And the room went silent. And my billionaire boss leaned across the table. And he said in a voice laced with sarcasm, "I don't have the brain capacity to think about the system as a whole, Sam. I can only think about what's good for us and our business." And I felt like I'd had the wind knocked out of me. But when I regained my breath, I just felt sad. Because here it was, the absolute personification of this Western belief system, some lives mattering more than others. To this billionaire, his wealth was more important than the people that were losing their jobs and their homes and the parents that couldn't feed their children. And it wasn't just this billionaire who believed it. I believed it. That's why I'd spent every day for the past 8 years trying to make more money. I was desperate to be important, to make it to the top, to matter. And for the first time, I saw the destructiveness of that belief system, how all of us on Wall Street in our all-consuming search for our own value through money and success were oblivious to the damage that we were causing. And so that led to one of the most torturous internal struggles of my life. Each day I would wrestle with myself. One part of me would ask, am I crazy for even thinking of walking away from a stream of multi-million-dollar bonuses as far as the eye can see? But another part of me would say there's got to be more to life than this endless accumulation of money this constant jockeying for position and power. But did I believe that enough to walk away from what I'd been chasing my whole life? My inner conflict was so deep that I got sick 14 times that year with the cold or the flu. But at the end of that year, I made a decision to trust that voice that was calling out for a life that was more meaningful than the one I was living, and I left Wall Street. And I didn't know where I was going to go, but I knew I had to leave New York because being around all that wealth and ambition was like a recovering alcoholic spending his days in a bar with his drinking buddies. And so I decided to move to a place with absolutely no focus on wealth and ambition, Los Angeles, which also happens to be a pretty good place to reinvent yourself. And I had a new girlfriend at the time, Kirsten, who was just finishing medical school, and she was able to arrange to do her residency at USC. And all the details sort of fell into place, and so we packed our bags and moved out of the city, and we moved to Los Angeles. And when we arrived, I had no idea what I was going to do, except that I wanted to do the complete opposite of what I'd been doing on Wall Street, and so I started volunteering. And I worked with homeless teens in a drop-in center, and I taught writing to girls in the foster system, and I started going into jails and juvenile halls to speak about getting sober from drugs and alcohol. 3 years later, I come home one day, bubbling with excitement from a day at the local jail and connecting with the inmates, and I pull Kirsten to the couch and tell her all about my day, and when I'm done talking, she says, in order to continue this connected, energized feeling, let's do, one of our favorite activities. Let's watch a documentary. Kirsten and I are not the coolest couple in the world, but that day, we chose A Place at the Table, which is about hunger in America, how in the richest country in the world, millions of children don't know where their next meal is coming from. To put it into perspective, 50 million people rely on food stamps. That's 1/6 of the population. And the poor survive on the cheapest and least healthy food, so many are both food insecure and obese. And after the movie, Kirsten and I sat on the couch talking about what we'd seen, and as we were talking, I had this startling realization that the majority of documentaries that we'd ever seen were more or less about the same thing. They were all about this hierarchical belief system that Linda had talked about years before. Executives at the top of so many industries were saying, without actually saying it, my life matters more than yours. Executives in oil companies saying, my profit is more important than you having clean water. Heads of food companies saying, my wealth is more important than your health. Heads of Wall Street saying, my money is more important than your home. Even heads of private prison companies saying, my money is more important than your freedom. And the list goes on. In nearly every industry, executives worldwide were echoing the sentiments of my billionaire boss. I can only think about what's good for us and our business. And these executives were making decisions that benefited themselves financially at the expense of other people. And the consequence of those decisions, they all landed in the same place, on poor families who have freeways built through their neighborhoods and waste dumped in their backyards, whose children attend underfunded and sometimes decrepit schools. Everywhere you turn, it seems, the deck is stacked against them, and especially so when it comes to health. They are disproportionately targeted by food company advertisements, receive no nutrition education. Many work 2 to 3 jobs, so who has time to cook? And even if they wanted to, there are often no fresh produce markets in their neighborhoods. Instead, fast food companies on nearly every corner peddle cheap, highly addictive, unhealthy food. In 1,000 different ways, we've told poor families that they are not as valuable as people with money. People weren't just hungry and obese because of a toxic food culture. They were also stressed out, beaten down, and depressed from growing up in a culture that had told them from birth that they were worthless, and then turned around and sold them cheap, highly addictive food to ameliorate their psychic pain. It was and is a vicious cycle. And so I turned to Kirsten on the couch and I voiced an idea for the first time, and I said, let's start an organization to help these struggling families. And that was the moment that Grocery Ships was born. We started with the idea of buying healthy groceries for hungry families, and that then morphed into an idea for buying healthy groceries, but also educating people in nutrition, but also all the other skills needed to safely navigate a toxic food environment, like reading labels and cooking healthy food and navigating grocery stores. We also wanted to provide them access to resources, and so resources that they ordinarily wouldn't have access to, so we called Vitamix, and they donated high-end blenders. And we called Filmmakers, and they donated DVDs. But soon, at that point I realized I'd been working with Linda for 11 years at that point. And so I knew that education and resources could only be the beginning. We couldn't just focus on the physical aspects of health. We'd have to focus also on the mental, emotional, and spiritual aspects as well, much like Kaiser's focus on total health. So I went and I asked Linda for her advice, and she gave me a sort of cryptic answer. She said, maybe you want to contact Father Boyle. I didn't know Father Boyle, and neither did Linda, and the Homeboy website didn't list his email address, but I dutifully typed up an email to Homeboy and sent it off, and a few hours later I got an email from the man himself asking me to come see him at Homeboy Industries. Now, Homeboy was nothing like the dingy warehouse that I had expected. It was actually all glass and gleaming surfaces and so big it took up a city block. And inside, funnily enough, it looked like a hedge fund. But instead of traders in Italian suits, there were gang members, former gang members, with tattoos. When I walked in to see Father Greg, he met me with this huge smile as if I was the one person in the world he was most eager to see. And he invited me to sit and tell him about my idea. And when I did, he said he loved it. And I was filled with amazement at a world where I had just read about this guy, and now I was sitting with him, and he was saying that he wanted to partner with us. And then the meeting ended, and we stood up and walked out, and Father Greg gave me this big hug, and then he turned away, and immediately he was surrounded by men in suits, important-looking people asking him questions, shaking his hand. And it reminded me of my billionaire bosses, how when they would walk into the middle of a room, they'd become the center of it. Just then, this 12 or 13-year-old homeboy walked by, this scrawny kid, and as soon as Father Boyle saw him, he jumped out of this conversation and wrapped him in an enormous hug. And then while everybody waited, Father Boyle put his hands on the boy's shoulder and gave him his undivided attention. And when they were done talking, he wrapped him in another hug, and he sent the kid on his way. And I could see the kid's face, and there was joy across it, this enormous smile across his face. And tears came into my eyes as I realized how much my own life had changed. A few years ago, my billionaire boss had been my idol, and now with Father Greg, I saw the kind of man I now wanted to be, how my heroes had changed. But more importantly, and I think this is what Linda was getting at, I saw that the power of Homeboy wasn't in the thoroughness of their job training program or the extensiveness of their job placement network. It was in the attitude, the heart of the place, where everyone was valued and respected. And so I left that day determined to create Grocery Ships, and I spent the next few months building the organization and creating a logo and a website and getting lawyers and 501c3, and I met with just about every person in LA, nutritionists, doctors, social workers, professors, people that had to do with the food movement in one way or another. And then I watched all the healthy eating documentaries I could and read about a dozen books on food and the nutrition system, the food system. And then I sat down to write a nutrition curriculum. And what I wanted to do was distill the sort of most important information and also approach it from a slightly different perspective. And what I mean is that the majority of people that have struggled with food in their life that I've known have one thing in common, and that's that they blame themselves. But I'd come to see the obesity epidemic not as a massive failure of individual willpower, but at least in part due to our insane food culture. So one thing I wanted to do was throw out this idea of portion sizes, which I think subtly blames people for eating too much of food that has been designed to make them overeat. And instead, we started our curriculum focused on how the food system has changed over the past 50 years, how the rise in obesity has mirrored the rise in processed food. We also took a good hard look at the 5 food groups: fruits, vegetables, protein, grains, dairy, which seemed antiquated, as if people were eating too much fresh fruit or fish instead of eating processed food, which didn't fit into any of those categories. And so we wanted to give people a useful framework for thinking about the modern food environment, and so we threw out those 5 and came up with 3 food groups: processed food, restaurant food, and real food. And the message was pretty simple. Processed food is most likely unhealthy, even if it says it's healthy. And restaurant food, pretty much whatever you order, has insane amounts of sugar, salt, and fat. And real food is probably your healthiest bet, although, and this is key, it is easier said than done. And we knew that too. We didn't want to assume people could do that, because I have trouble doing that. And so then as much time as I spent on the nutrition curriculum, I focused even more time on the structure of the organization. And the key point, the structure of the program, and the key point for me was that everybody would sit in a circle. Nutrition educators, grocery staff, the people we were working with in a circle, to emphasize that everyone was equal. About 7 or 8 months in, we had a volunteer staff now of about 8 people, and we'd put this all together, and so we started meeting at my house on Sundays to go through the curriculum ourselves before we would give it to other people. And most of the people involved in the program at that time were from the west side of Los Angeles, which is predominantly upper middle class. And so I thought that we would learn the most from the nutrition education and how that played out, and a little less from the sort of support group environment. But what we found was the complete opposite, that even though most of the people involved in the program didn't suffer from obesity, everyone had a tortured, self-lacerating relationship with their own body. Most had been on diets their whole life. And that's when I realized that the obesity crisis wasn't just about poor people, and it wasn't just about obese people. It was about all of us. So many of us have had our relationships with our own bodies poisoned. As word got out, our little group began to grow, and friends came, and then friends of friends, and then we had this raucous meeting going every Sunday, and it became clear to me that there was this deep need for a safe space to talk about internal struggles. And then we were ready to start accepting applications and interviewing people for our pilot program, which had 8 spots. And one of the first people we interviewed was a woman named Helen, who's in her 50s, from South Central. Now, Helen told us that she is the caretaker for 6 children, none of whom are hers. They're all the children of her brothers and sisters who are drug addicts and live on the street. And those brothers and sisters are allowed into Helen's house twice a year on Thanksgiving and Christmas, and they can come into the house and shower and then eat a meal with their children, but then they have to go. And every time this happens, Helen said, the kids would seek reassurance. They'd say, Helen, am I going to turn out like my mom? And she'd say, no, you're going to turn out like me. And that's why she wanted to do our program, because she wanted to teach them how to eat healthy. And when I heard that, I just sat in silence as this terrible feeling of fear swept through me because I had spent so much time thinking about the clever nutrition education and the program structure and even the philosophy of grocery ships. But the truth was, I had no idea what it was like to live in South Central or walk in Helen's shoes. I was a white 30-something Ivy League guy for whom the hardest thing I'd ever done was walk away from a 7-figure-a-year job. What experience did I have that Helen could benefit from? And how were we going to relate? And I called Linda and asked her, and she said, just tell your story and speak from your heart and be humble. And a month later, the pilot program began, and we all sat in a circle. There were 3 of us from grocery ships, 8 women from South LA, and the skepticism in the room was palpable. Everywhere I looked, my eyes were met with doubting stares of the women in South LA. But I took a deep breath and I leapt in and described the structure of the program, how the first hour was focused on education and the second hour was focused on a sharing circle to talk about emotions. And then I said that up until this precise moment, grocery ships had only been an idea. And this was the moment it became reality, but the truth was I didn't know if it would work. But I thought it could, and I thought if it did, it could help a lot of people. And then I invited these women to help co-create this program that might help their community and a lot of other communities. And a few women looked at me and nodded, and a few just didn't say anything. And then we went to introductions where we said how we got here, and women shared about how the obesity crisis had impacted them. Family members that had died, the diabetes, the kids getting teased. When it was my turn, I talked about my own family's history of obesity, how my dad was overweight his whole life, tortured by it, type 2 diabetes. My mom, overweight her whole life, tortured by it, bariatric surgery. My younger brother also had bariatric surgery. I come from a family of obesity. And then I talked about my own personal struggles, not just my past struggles, but my current struggles. I said, one night last week, I ate 6 donuts. And the women looked at me with a measure of doubt, as if to say, this is the guy that's going to teach us how to get healthy? But I'm not. And that's the thing, is grocery ships is not about an expert who's been fixed coming in to teach you how to get healthy. I have struggled with food every single day of my life. I was a very heavy kid. I got teased quite a bit because of it. As an adult, I've got a handle on it, but the truth is I've been on a diet for about 20 years, trying to lose the same 20 pounds. It hasn't worked yet, but I'm hopeful. After the meeting, I was exhausted, and the truth was I didn't have too much to show for it because the women had asked few questions, and when the sharing circle came, they gave 1 or 2 word answers and then passed. We'd actually ended the meeting early because there was so little participation. But I was undaunted. In the second meeting, I got there early and set up the chairs in a perfect circle and put out 8 brand new Vitamixes, and at 6 p.m. sharp, sat down in my seat and waited for these women to come back. And a minute passed, and then 2 minutes passed, and then 5 minutes passed, and sweat erupted across my brow, and I had this sinking feeling in my stomach, and it was like that moment you throw a party, and 30 minutes after the start time, you're sitting there with a bowl of chips and dip and feeling like a total idiot because no one has shown up, but this was worse because we'd spent a whole year planning it. I felt nauseous, and minutes dragged on. And then finally at 6:10, the door opened, and every single family filed in. Turned out the gate had been locked. They'd had to get a security guard to open it and let them in. So I sort of wiped my brow and took a breath, and then we began. And in the nutrition education part of the period of the meeting that day, my partner Angela taught how to make vegetable smoothies. And let me tell you, I was not sure how kale shakes were going to go over in South Central, but they love them. At least that's what they said. But when it got to the sharing circle part, we again hit a wall. The women were reserved, guarded, one-word answers. When it was my turn, I told about how difficult it was to be a kid growing up heavy in this world. I told them how my identical twin brother and me, instead of being called the Polk brothers, were called the Pork brothers. Oh, the women loved that. So the next week, the third week, we started the meeting the same way we always did, which is reading a few passages about the principles of grocery ships and then going into a check-in where the question is, how are you doing? And again, it was the same thing, one or two word answers. And then it was Helen's turn, and Helen looked up at me and she said, you know, it's been 20 years since someone asked me how I was doing. And tears welled up in her eyes and gently rolled down her face. And she continued on and said she'd taken care of people her whole life, and that this program had made her realize that she was important too, that she was worth taking care of, and that she'd realized that this program wasn't just about food, it was about the value of her soul. And tears came from my eyes as I listened to Helen describe more perfectly than I ever could exactly what I'd dreamed this program could be. After Helen, the next woman went and she shared about an abusive marriage and she cried. And the woman after that shared about losing 50 pounds and then gaining it back, and then she cried. And soon the emotional wall between us began to crumble. And over the next few meetings, we started having to put Kleenex in the center of the circle, because when one person cried, we all cried. And soon I began hearing reports of grocery store carts filled with colorful produce and kids making their favorite kale shakes for their friends. And the participants started eating better and sleeping better and exercising more and losing weight. But what was for me perhaps the most profoundly touching part of it was what was happening on an emotional and spiritual level. The women started referring to the grocery ships meeting as their safe space. Helen would say that when she walked in, she would unzip herself, and then 2 hours later she would zip herself back up to go face the world. The women started referring to each other as their family. For 12 weeks straight, not a single person missed a single meeting, and now, 5/6 of the way through that 6-month program, the attendance rate is 97%. My favorite quote is from Juana, a young mom, who said, "I love this group because it reminds me that I exist." Soon it became clear that something special was going on, so much so that reporters started asking to come, and with the permission of the family, we actually let an LA Times reporter embed herself with our group to write a profile from the inside. And while I'd love to think that it was because of the cleverness of the nutrition curriculum, I think the reason there's so much interest is because what we've done is create a safe, sacred space, an emotional oasis in the modern world. And what has grown in that space is connection. Child psychologist Alice Miller says that we are all called to be enlightened witnesses, people through who their attention and presence and kindness return people back to themselves. That's what Linda had done for me. That's what Father Boyle does for the homies. And that's what we were doing for each other in that room. By bearing witness to each other's struggles, we were helping each one of us rediscover our own value. And now at every meeting, Helen talks about how grateful she is that we brought grocery ships to South Central Los Angeles. But here's the thing, I don't know who this program has impacted more, Helen or me. I've been eating better and losing weight, chopping away at those 20 pounds. But on an emotional level, it's been even more powerful. I feel like I belong to a community. In that room, for those 2 hours, it's not about service provider and service recipient. It's about mutuality. In that room, it's not about us and them. It's about us. And that's what I've come to understand circle consciousness as, standing together, not in service, but in community. And now at the end of every Grocery Ships meeting, I walk away with a heart full because I feel connected to the group and to myself. Each week after those meetings, I am returned to myself, to that place we all started at, of wholeness and of empathy and of love. And here's what I've learned from those meetings. It's not about poor people and rich people. It's about all people. The poverty and inequality of our world are symptoms of a spiritual disconnection on a cultural level, and that disconnection impacts all of us. While I do believe that the 1% needs to give some of the money they have hiding in their Fidelity accounts to poor people, that's not just to help poor people, but to help them as well. Because what we all want is to feel connected. And amidst great wealth, there can exist a deep spiritual poverty. As Mother Teresa said, the problems in our world all stem from the fact that we've forgotten that we belong to each other. And I believe that the first step towards reconnecting with one another is to reconnect with ourselves and remember our own inherent value. And that's why my vision is not for a Grocery Ships group in every poor community, but a Grocery Ships group in every community, rich and poor alike. Because I believe that so many of us need a safe space to work on our health together and be reminded at least once a week of our own inherent value. In fact, in September, we're going to start a corporate wellness program to bring safe connection spaces into corporations. And the best part of that is that the money from that corporate wellness program will flow to low-income groups in the surrounding areas. That is circle consciousness. People restoring connection to themselves, their colleagues, and their surrounding community in one fell swoop. So 3 months into the program, Helen shared in the sharing circle how she was inspired by the knowledge she was learning, and she wanted to bring it to the rest of South Central LA. And so she started the process towards making a community-wide film screening of movies like Food Inc. and Fed Up. And in that moment, I saw the power of circle consciousness, how when you help empower somebody by reminding them of their own value, they bloom like flowers. I said it, they bloom like flowers. Helen is already showing, with new passion, is already showing signs of becoming a great community leader. Maybe she will be the one to bring real change to the food system in South Central. With a community behind you to support you and share your burdens, anything is possible. Helen and her children, by the way, are a Kaiser family. So thank you for all the work you do here at Kaiser, not only at Kaiser, but in all the surrounding communities and all these wonderful initiatives being celebrated today. And let me personally thank you for the opportunity to share my story, for taking care of my family, for taking care of Helen's family, and for allowing Grocery Ships to stand in community with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam, for those encouraging and heartfelt words over your presentation. That was amazing. For the rest of the afternoon, I wanted to just let you know that we have a 15-minute break that starts now, and at 1:45, the workshop sessions will continue. For those of you that are in Thriving Schools and KP Workforce, you'll return to the Marina and Presidio room. That starts at 1:45, and you will go until 5. For those of you that are in Track 2, you have a choice of the mental health workshop, which will be in the Pacific Heights room, or the policy reform workshop session, which will be in the Seacliff room. You end at 3 p.m. and have a few hours to yourself. And we just ask that you all return at 5:30. We will be in the Regency foyer, which is right out here, outside of the grand ballroom. And from 5:30 to 6:30, we will have a hosted bar. Please join us. Dinner will start promptly at 6:30, and that would be in the grand ballroom. Thank you very much.